I am Christa Buthelezi, the editor and curator of Odyssey Magazine, back with another conversation with a woman whose path I find personally really inspiring and interesting. This is Nicky Rowbotham. Nicky, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate your presence here.
Thanks, Christa. It's wonderful to be here.
I will, as I always do, let you introduce yourself. You are a multifaceted individual, so I'm curious to hear how you introduce yourself.
If you'd spoken to me 10 years ago, I most probably would have introduced myself with a title or a corporate that I've worked for, etc. But I tend to just introduce myself now as a curious, multi-passionate individual who's looking to have impact, to light a path in a different way. I do have many facets, as you've mentioned. I'm a leader in the corporate space and have been for over 25 years. But I also have multiple interests outside of corporate, including businesses that I run, a journal company, Inspired Change. I've got my foundational frequency center. I'm an author and a writer and a speaker. In terms of my published sort of works. But, and funny enough, we were talking about this just before we started this call, is we all have these facets of ourselves, and it just depends on which facet we're bringing to light at any given time. And I love the fact that it's quite mysterious around how I introduce myself, because it's not one thing, it's not one role, it's not one title, it's not one facet. All of these make up who I am, but really all of them lead to the fact that I want to have impact in terms of showing a different and more supportive way and more easeful way for people to navigate life.
Your mission, your purpose is clearly aligned with that of Odyssey's. I want to, just so we don't forget, because this came up when we were talking before we began to record, there's, especially for younger people who might not have heard this, a Walt Whitman quote, a part of a poem that he wrote from Song of Myself. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. I wish more people knew that and felt comfortable in, I just think, well, we were talking about, South Africa and the way learners, I have a daughter who will be I just got goosebumps, is doing matric next year, my youngest. And, so I'm very deep in all of that. And it's so clear. It's like there are about six paths that you can take. And then lo and behold, there aren't enough varsity spots, and lo and behold, there aren't always enough positions. But what if we allow people from a young age to understand that not only it's all right, not just give them permission, I guess that's the first step, but expect that human beings are not one-dimensional. How? Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's one thing for those outside of us to give us permission, but I felt the game changed when I gave myself permission, because even as recent as 4 or 5 years ago, I thought I was going to change lanes. I thought I was going to step out of a corporate leadership space and very much be sort of like outside of corporate. And it was almost like the universe said to me, no, it's about rebalancing in both and expanding to hold more. And it's almost like it's kind of pulled me back into corporate leadership to show a different way to lead from a more balanced space within corporate while still operating differently. Outside of corporate space in my wellness and healing center that I have foundational frequency here in Johannesburg. And it's been amazing to watch, because people are looking to put me in a box. And the most liberating thing was I basically turned around and said, you can't. This is all of me. And I give myself permission rather than waiting for someone outside of me to give me permission as well. That also comes with age.
It does come with age, and it comes with self-compassion and self-acceptance. For absolutely sure, I agree with you that it begins and probably ends, and the most important part is within, although we are conditioned to expect different. And I certainly don't live in a box, as you know. And just my name, that on my Gumede is my father's name, so it's not on my on my ID, but Buthelezi is, my legal name is Christa Buthelezi. And people just, I mentioned I was up in the bush at a lodge this weekend. And one of the first things, well, we were wondering who Christa Buthelezi was, but we weren't thinking it was you. And I said, oh, really? What did you expect? And they're like, swallowing their tongues. I really feel like there's a John F. Kennedy quote that came up in another interview. I was being interviewed over the weekend. To those whom much is given, much is expected. And he meant it, the Kennedys, very wealthy family, I mean, not maybe all by great methods. And yet, there is this really strong drive for community service, not just in politics, but in other areas within the family. I grew up with a lot of them. With most of them have that drive. Others of them have a different drive. And that's what he was referring to. But I think it also applies to this. If you have developed and have the gifts, I mean, we all have the gifts, but if you've unwrapped the gifts of seeing life as much more than surface level, or what we're taught is right and wrong and possible, then I think there's an obligation. So I love that while you were called to stay in the corporate area, and honestly, of all the areas in the world, what doesn't need consciousness more? So bless you and thank you. But then you were also called to start the center where people can come in. I think of it, I would love for us to have a physical Odyssey Center at some point like this, and we'll be doing more events and things to create the same thing, to create something where people at different levels of comfort can come and be in what only becomes a more and more safe and whole vessel. That's that's an incredible way of giving back.
And it is exactly that. It's a way of giving back. I thought it was going to be a new avenue for my career, and it was almost like I was sort of one foot in both worlds, and have my little own personal moment of which one is it going to be. And funny enough, and this is where I'll reference my guardians. I call them my guardians as opposed to my guides. Almost had a bit of a chuckle with me, and they said, "You'd be bored if you did one thing." And
I would be.
I would. It is my nature that I love to be stimulated in a multi-passionate way. And I'm able to bring all of the skill sets that I have from a corporate environment into running what some could be deemed a more conscious or spiritual business, and run it in a very different way that doesn't sit in what I call that sort of wounded feminine, wounded healer type energy where everything is whatever you need, we'll give everything. It brings a fair amount of boundary to that conversation in terms of self-commitment. If you booked and paid, you need to show up, etc. Rather than people rescheduling after they're supposed to arrive. And I've seen that create a little bit of friction and resistance for people. But it's about me holding that center in a very balanced way. If you're going to talk balance, masculine and feminine, coming from that heart space where I want to be there to support, but it has to be in the right way, in a very boundaried way that works for both you and I. If I talk to someone as a client, but I bring the same energy to corporate. It's about that energy of authenticity that I bring my full same self to anything I show up in, rather than different versions of myself. And that really helped me to become more aligned and consistent for myself, but also for everyone else around me, because they were getting a single version of me, no matter where I'm showing up, but still in a way that is of service and giving back and showing a different way.
Yeah, beautifully said. So a couple of thoughts on that. One, if you look at children, think about a play schooler. I worked in the Montessori world, which is, probably the penultimate for this kind of thing, or Waldorf, but even, play schools and creches and things like that. Or even at home, children explore constantly. in so many ways. They'll go from running to sitting and reading a book to playing with a train to wanting to play in the kitchen and make something to, and then they collapse and take a nap, which we could also take we could internalize that too. And then they go again, and they're all over the place. To me, children are much closer to innate human nature because they haven't been formed yet by all the outside things. So if you think about that, it only kind of makes sense. And authenticity is kind of an overused word. I love the word authenticity. I love the word sovereignty, and they're both getting kind of cliche, which is really sad to me because they're two of the most beautiful concepts, I think, in the world and the most human ones. So I don't think that people understand the impact on others or on your own health and well-being of being who you are and being all of who you are, or at least more of what you are. The masking, particularly, I think I'm probably, considerably older than you. And I worked in commercial real estate and construction management. I worked for a Texan real estate development company. It was great training, but it was like, darling, I don't care how you get it done. Go do it. Here's the checkbook. We'll have tequila after. Those were, those were my guidelines. We had boundaries, but not some. And at a time when women, I was in the American South. I was 25. I was, I did like runway modeling for charity, and I was tall and blonde, and the whole thing, and learned to be different than people expected me to be, and that element of surprise was really helpful. But I also learned, thank God for them. I mean, with the magazine, I find myself reflecting on a lot of what I learned from that team. And these guys had been in Vietnam, so they had been right up to death and had seen so many people die, and they came back determined to just do things their way. And I guess I picked up on that. But that was not the experience of most women in business, and still isn't the experience of most women in business. And I've never, until Odyssey, I've never felt that comfortable in a corporate environment, to be honest with you. And now I'm creating that environment for our team. So the impact, but I want, and that's creating a very different environment for my team. So I'm seeing the impact of that, and then it'll impact the magazine. For you, being in a very corporate environment, and I will say a corporation that is, I think, more enlightened than many, from my own experience on the other side as a client. How do you see your being in, well, integrity is the word I like to use. So you're very much in integrity with who you are. How do you see that impact people there? And then how do you take that to your center and bring it there?
So for me, it's not about doing it in corporate and then taking it to another place. To your point, it all has to be in alignment. And the best way I look at integrity, and I've had this conversation in both spaces, my center, my businesses, as well as in corporate, my words and my actions need to align. And as soon as I see a lack of alignment in words and actions, I do what I say I'm going to do. If someone doesn't do what they say they're going to do, for me, that's automatically out of integrity. And when things do slip, and life will happen, trust me, that is the given everywhere. Have the conversation, own it. Just be very clear.
Don't let it stew. Yeah.
And so for me, it's a consistent across the board, and that's why I don't talk about versions of myself. This is who I am, showing up in all of them, and we'll operate. I operate exactly the same in any environment that I tend to be in, and I call it out in a very compassionate way when I see there's a lack of integrity. And for me, it's all about that compassion rather than just empathy. And I've seen this in the past in quite a few areas where people expect you, I call it getting in the hole with them. When they're like, oh, if they're in that victim energy, etc., and everyone else is to blame other than their own actions that they're no longer owning, they expect you to get into the hole with them, and then they end up pulling the ladder in with you, and then you're all down at that energy. So for
And the
me,
ladder
it's
falls in and you're all stuck.
yes. So for me, it's around lighting a different way and showing a different way. I have compassion. I see that you're struggling with this, but let me light the way for you, in terms of bringing words and actions back into alignment, which brings more and that consistency across the board. And that's where I'd use a term like authenticity. But I agree with you, sovereignty and authenticity, which are very important concepts for me, have become grossly overused in many areas from that perspective.
Build
Um,
it, like not
yeah.
well, when anything becomes a catchphrase or that, then you kind of lose. Yeah.
And so for me, I will operate exactly the same regardless of the environment that I'm in from that perspective. And I'll ask for that alignment between words and actions to be in integrity and own our side of the street, because something will happen. But let's be very clear. What is the role I could play in this? Or how could that change how I've shown up? And that's why, for example, when someone books and pays for a session at the center, they've made a commitment to themselves. And if you're rescheduling after the session started 15 times over, that's being out of integrity with oneself. And, I've had many people say, well, they're letting us down. I said, it's not us. They're letting themselves down. And that's what I have to mirror to them. And so a big part of the role that I take across the board is also, someone says to me, oh, but we have to save people. I said, no, that's not the role that we play in any facet of my life. Mine is to show a different way. Because if we think that it's our job to control, to force, to influence another's path, we're stepping outside of our own sort of integrity. We get to control our path. We get to show a different way and hopefully inspire others to walk alongside us. But everyone has their own journey, their own path, their own perspectives, and we want to allow them the freedom to walk that.
But you inspire people to act differently versus doing it through control. And that is a really, really key difference. Compassion is certainly part of that. I consider shame to be like the most destructive force on earth. Um,
And
and
ironically, it's a word South Africans overuse.
I was, I know. Um, I, I, I was very taken aback by that when I arrived in South Africa, and I spent quite a bit of time in the Western Cape and heard it even more there, um, when I was first here. But I hear it everywhere, and I say it too. But in my mind, it's SHEM, and it's a different. I've come to see it as a different thing
Yeah.
because I tend my brain works in isiZulu a lot, so SHEM somehow I can justify. So there's shame, which is destructive. There's fear, which is motivates much of what is in the world right now, and we are controlled by manipulating our fear, and our shame, particularly women with the shame thing, I think. And then there's this very limited range of possibility, which goes back to the being multifaceted, because so much of it is set up as you will be this or you will be that. There's a great deal of pressure, again, high school kids, to that grade 9 thing where they have to decide what they're going to study for the next 3 years. I don't know about you, but I've changed a lot since grade 9. Obviously, I've flipped myself to the other side of the world, and in many ways. And this idea of limiting people to whatever you decide in grade 9, or so maybe you change for varsity, but your brain isn't fully formed at that point, not for years to come, not till you're done with varsity in almost every case. Um, it 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 speaks to me, makes me sad, because I don't feel like people get to experience more than a fraction of the life that they could live.
And it's often within the constraints of their own limiting beliefs. Um, because
Yeah, most of which are taught, but not all. Yeah.
and I often refer to that conditioning that we sort of get layered onto us as we evolve and we grow. And in my second book, Embrace Your Elegant Power, I talk about unshackling from the shoulds, which are all the layers of conditioning. And I actually ask people, especially within the teams I work with, people I encounter in everyday life, I said, actually count how many times you say should during the course of a day.
The coulda is an American term, and that's should have, would have, could have.
And
So much limitation.
I often say and it for everyone, it's different depending on when you start to see the world differently, or maybe those rose-colored glasses drop. For me, it's after 35, 36. Some people, it's a little later, maybe it's 40, 42. But there's kind of that sort of moving through the first 35 years of your life when you are dealing with a lot of that, the physical stuff that you're having to work through and all of that those conditioned constraints. And then you move into what for me is a more conscious realm, where you start to actually go, what do I really need out of this life? And what do I want to be? What do I want to give back? And how do I want to see things differently? And your perspectives start to change. And for me, that's where, for me personally, those limited constraints dropped away. And I realized this was all within my sort of choosing. Only if I owned my choices and the consequences that come with it. It's really that ownership, sort of an internal authority that I stepped into. But I know for some people that's more difficult, depending on the environments you're in and how embedded that is. But my soul had a very strong lens that it was time to drop all of that, and really gave me no choice. And if I'd stayed within those constraints, I think it would have been a very linear, very one-dimensional, and way less colorful and exciting journey. But as I said to someone, as a reformed chartered accountant with an MBA in competitive economics, who now runs a center that works with energy healing, consciousness, space for nervous system regulation, which for a lot of people are complete opposite ends of the spectrum.
Well, they're perceived that way. They've been, I mean, that's a control mechanism too. There are those who would like to be in power in the world. Look, if people who are awake are far harder to control than people who are not. I do think it takes, to your point of what you're saying. I think, in human design, I don't know if it's in all, but certainly in some, there are these steps. So sort of to 30 to 50, there's also astrological, your Saturn return. And for me, like I'm 64, it's like third act, and then that nearly dying thing. It's sort of okay, that was a real reckoning. I think part of it is my age, but certainly, coding twice and all that ICU time and all the predictions that I shouldn't have lived, which I didn't find helpful. It's like, okay, so if I stayed, why, if I should not have lived through that, sometimes there are big events like that, or, someone will have a near-death experience of any sort, or cancer, or, it often, the waking up things are often not pretty, and they require bravery, courage to some degree, yeah, but they also require just this knowing. And I wonder, you mentioned your guardians before. I work, as you know, a lot with ancestral things, and you can call those, I don't care what we call them, but this idea that I think basically has been wiped out of many cultures, and human beings really need to know that there's something more, that we are held by something, that we rise on the shoulders of those who went before us. What does that look like for you? Are you open to talking about that?
Absolutely. So when I first, and this would have been when I was about 37, 38, when I first started interacting with, and then they would have introduced themselves to me as my guides. And were ancestral members, there were sort of metaphysical beings, energy beings. And I mean, all of mine, interestingly enough, introduced themselves by name. And for many people, that's quite unusual. But what's happened since over the last 8, 9 years is I've evolved how I've worked with them. I was first of all open to it because I've always believed in a higher power and incredible support. They've been around my whole life and I've encountered them in very different situations. I was washed out to sea at the age of 13, caught in riptide. And the level of support, I was never afraid. And literally my dad came around from the next door cove on a surf ski, completely supported. And, it was from then that I've always known I was being guided and supported. But the relationship starts at about 37, 38 for me. I'm now 46. But what's happened over the last few years as new waves of guides came in, and they called themselves guides initially, you start to, I saw myself, and I'm going to talk to my personal experience here, attributing maybe a level of authority to them outside of myself. And, I find myself saying, oh, my guides indicated this. And then what started to shift was I realized that they were higher presence versions of myself. And hence it's almost like, and I often navigate the world with two particular ones on either side of me. And they just said, we're here, we're helping shepherd you through this and make sure that this journey that we've asked you to step into is protected. But I've realized that this is a sort of wisdom coming from higher versions of myself. And I say versions, not because I'm schizophrenic or we have multiple personalities.
To be clear, not talking schizophrenia, although there was a point in time when I wondered, I didn't feel like I could talk to anyone about it. Because I was working with the homeless, and there were they had just released a lot of people. They shut down a lot of the government mental health hospitals in the States. And so most of those people were unhoused and unhomed. And so I saw them walking around, and I was like, well, I can't tell anyone about this because I'm going to end up there. I was sure.
Absolutely.
They've been around my whole life, but they came back actually at 37. That's interesting. Same age.
Yeah. And so now I regard them as guardians. They're guardians of my path, guardians of the journey that I'm on, guardians of my soul, because my soul is eternal, and it's just the timeline that I happen to be stepping through at this point in time that they're working with me on. And so what I love is how it's evolved, how they come in and out as they're needed on the journey, depending on the strength that I'm calling in. And they're ever present, but it's required a relationship with them, and they come through to me in kind of my own voice, as it were. One or two of them have a very different voice, so I can very clearly attribute it to that individual. But it's normally an energy that I'm calling in to support a particular part of my journey. And I work with them a lot through the Akashic records as well. That's where I've gotten to see them. That's where I've gotten to engage in conversation with them very directly. And that's when other guardians have come in and stepped in for a piece of advice, for a moment in the journey, as it were. But
a certain situation or something. Yeah.
But this is very, and knowing that I'm working with, I refer to my intuition as my knowing. And that's often how their wisdom has come through to me, very much. And sometimes I will hear it as a conversation. I will see it as a movie trailer. And for a lot of people, this is far-fetched. But there came a point when I had to start talking about it because I couldn't. If I was going to be in integrity with myself, I wasn't going to start saying, oh, I know this. I was going to refer to this as my knowing based
it's
on
also an honoring of them, I think. But Kabangu, I believe that many of us now are being more called to, I think that's why Odyssey came to me and I came to Odyssey at the same time. I think we're being more called to it. My work, my personal work with people is all around normalizing the intuitive. It is a guidance system we all have. It is something that has been taken from us in order to control us. I firmly believe that from the industrial age. And again, it makes people a lot easier to control if they can't tap into this knowing. It does, I think, because of the control aspects, and it's been many generations now. When I do crossovers and ancestral work with people, and I'm thinking, but it happens in different arenas, but I'm thinking specifically of Black African people. their ancestors will weep because they brought their families to Christianity for many as a survival mechanism. They really felt like that was the best way, or in some cases because they thought it was better because white people had it. Um, and they and there's nothing wrong with that as an addition. It's the giving up of the traditional ways, because African spirituality is very base human. It contains the elements clearing, grounding, connection that human beings need. I firmly believe that, and that's why I studied it. I mean, that's why, other than it was just part of my calling. And the system. I'm a very good Christian Buddhist traditionalist. Um, yeah, the little I was quite fascinated with some forms of Judaism in between. So, but that's a multifaceted thing. And why not? And why not? So it's that what saddens me and also motivates me to do what I do and to talk to people like you is, and to normal, and just have a normal, I mean, we are two reasonably upstanding members of society. You might be more than me. And and we are clearly sane, and we are clearly all of those things. And we carry this air of compassion. And here we are talking about something that scares the bejesus out of most people. Um, do you run into that in your world much? I do a lot. That's the biggest thing people have to overcome.
Absolutely. And especially within the corporate arena, when my intuition comes through, and to try and put it politely, I gently call
I
B.
know.
When something and you know that something completely different has happened and you know exactly how it's unfolded, um, it's how you manage it in a way that isn't confronting for that individual. Because again, I don't want to create fear. And this isn't
Or be dismissed immediately.
agreed. And so I've used it in a very different way. And sometimes my intuition is just for me. It's not for everyone else. It's for me to know and then operate differently. Um, and for some people that's very confronting, that I'm not attached to, like I would have been in the past, to an outcome or forcing an outcome or for something to fit a picture, because I've often had the intuitive guidance that the story's changed, how we need to move has changed. And I flow with that very effortlessly, especially where, for example, I had someone who was going to join a team like a few weeks ago, and they declined the offer because they'd accepted a counter. And I just immediately, there was no resistance on my side. I just went, thank you for saving me for that, from that which I couldn't even see. And I don't know what that is right now. It's that whole redirection protection piece. And I believe that in many different things. My friends, what's been fascinating is because I do a lot of travel to ancient sites, and they understand.
To what, the Nile soon? Something? Yeah.
I'm back in Egypt after 26 years to go down the Nile, and I've got a strong connection to Egypt. But I've literally been to Machu Picchu, Angkor Wat. I've been twice to Stonehenge, into the middle of Stonehenge. But there's a sort of an ancestral connection there, and it's almost been, I've had to sort of like reauthorize those parts of myself, reawaken some of that ancient knowledge that's come with those sort of revisits to those sites. But
I want to stop you. That's a great word. Reauthorize. I was just talking about this today with my team, with two African members of my team. We've talked before about cultural appropriation, which is something I get questioned about a lot and accused, although not here. It's more American, people from abroad. Hardly ever here anymore. Uh, and the thing that, and look, I am very sensitive culturally. I love, like you do, I love other cultures, this reauthorizing and being able to discover places. I've walked in southern Spain and felt like I was in chainmail and boots and very male. And, it's so cool. It's such a cool perspective to have. But if we limit people to only being or partaking in ceremony or whatever in the skin that they're in this time, this meat suit, this my guides talk about it as our costumes, that life is a stage, Shakespeare was right, and that we come in different costumes and makeup and hair. And so we're precluding any possibility that we've ever been anything or ever will be anything than what we are. And it does scare people. But yet, ultimately, I don't know. I wonder what you think about this. I feel like the big human, if we could generalize to one big human injury in this time and space, it's a lack of belonging, a feeling like we don't belong, feeling like we're the only one. And, you know, if you are connected in this way, then you know you have belonged for time eternal, and you will.
And Brene Brown does a lot of work around that concept of belonging, but it's been interesting because the biggest theme for my lifetime that my soul signed up for was coming back to myself. I belong to myself. And funny enough, I think there's a line out of one of the songs from The Greatest Showman, which talks about, exactly that. And I've just got full body chills. And funny enough, it came onto, I often get nudged through whatever comes up on Spotify playlist from a random side thing or on an Instagram reel. It was exactly that song. And it really, in this lifetime, it was coming back home to myself to remember who I was and transcend some of that wounding from previous lives that I've walked and journeys that I've walked in this lifetime. And
Weaving
when we,
together. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's almost like it's sort of that falling back to that central space of being whole and being enough and belonging to myself before I need to ascribe belonging to a collective and something outside of myself. For me, I think that's where a lot of my sort of re-embodiment of my own power, that reauthorization, has come from. Because if I belong to myself first, I will belong inward.
And honestly, maybe this is a good place to leave this conversation. I look forward to more. But honestly, isn't that the way to freedom, really? Nicky, thank you. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts and always enjoy talking with you. Look forward to doing more of this and to hearing more. There's a wonderful article that is online that you've done that if you search Trojan horse, which is a great metaphor, will come up. And we've got some more writing of yours in our pipeline. So I look forward to sharing more of you with our readers. Thank you. And I hope you have a phenomenal trip and discover all kinds of great things.
Thank you, Christa.